Oh, good day. This is Rhonda reading from the Lost Gospel, the Book of Q, and Christian Origins by Burton L. Mack. Going to be reading part 1.2, An Uncommon Wisdom. When Harnack dared to publish the sayings of Jesus in 1907, he wanted the teachings of Jesus to be read without reference to the narrative Gospels. With a single stroke, he thought to eliminate the problem of miracle and myth and make it possible for readers to focus on what liberal theologians understood as the essence of Christianity. The genius of Jesus, according to 19th century liberals, was that of a remarkable teacher of an elevated and timeless humane ethic. Thus, Harnack thought that these teachings should set the standard for a civilized world. Liberal Christians honored Jesus for his teachings and thought of themselves as fortunate to stand at the end of an illustrious history of enlightenment. Harnack's plan must have sounded good at the time to large numbers of Christians and scholars, for it drew upon a long inculcation of Christian sensibility that flourished during the late 19th century. By then, the history of the human race was imagined on the model of the evolutionary education. The ages of pagan superstition and cultic religion had finally succumbed to the age of reason. For Protestants, reason and faith merged in the superior ethics of Christianity, and they saw themselves as pedagogues shining in the midst of an unenlightened but educable world. Since Jesus had introduced this ethic into the world as the highest human ideal, he simply could not have been the divine and tragic figure portrayed in the gospel accounts. So Harnack's daring promotion of the teachings of Jesus, apart from the narrative gospels, must have sounded reasonable to many liberal Christians. But as it turned out, this book was the last hurrah for the 19th century Jesus. Harnack should have known that the liberals' Jesus was in trouble, and perhaps he did. He was fighting for reason in the midst of a growing excitement about the presence of the apocalyptic language in the preaching of Jesus, and the thought that Jesus was driven by compelling conviction that the world was soon coming to its end. The book that started the excitement, excuse me, was Johannes Weiss's Jesus' Proclamation of the Kingdom of God, 1892. Weiss was impressed by the pronouncements of a future judgment found in the teachings of Jesus and with Jesus' announcement of a kingdom of God soon to be inaugurated. Weiss put these two themes together, kingdom of God and future judgment, and traced the source of such ideas to the apocalyptic future, excuse me, um, the apocalyptic literature of Judaism. He concluded that Jesus was a child of his time, a visionary and a proclaimer of an imminent apocalyptic transformation of the world. Consternation reigned as liberal theologians and historians of religion tried to position themselves in the face of growing suspicion that apocalyptic language had indeed been the order of Jesus' day. Schweitzer rode in on the quest of this wave and used the apocalyptic perspective to write his famous critique of the 19th century quest. The force of his argument was due to the sense of uncertainty scholars were experiencing because of this shift in paradigm from Jesus as a teacher of humane ethic to Jesus as a radical visionary of the cataclysmic end of the world. Schweitzer's own reconstruction of the life of Jesus was an interpretation of the Gospel of Matthew from the new perspective of Jesus as an apocalyptic prophet. According to Schweitzer, Jesus was mistaken about the imminent end of the world, but noble nonetheless because he had willingly sacrificed himself in an attempt to initiate the final conflagration. No one could simply ignore the apocalyptic buzz and prevail. For to counter the proposed to counter the proposal required taking a long, hard look at the gospel texts. Strangely, no one during the 19th century had thought it necessary to actually study the sayings of Jesus in rigorous historical perspective. Now it seemed that the presence of the apocalyptic idiom in the teachings of Jesus could hardly be denied. Thus, the relationship of the sayings of Jesus to an ethic of enlightenment, a relationship simply assumed by 19th century liberal scholars, became ever more difficult to see. Harnack's liberal Jesus was overpowered by the dramatic entrance of a strange and inhospitable figure into the 20th century imagination of Christian origins. Q was powerless to adjudicate such a conflict of images because it contains sayings that support both views of Jesus. There were sayings that liberals had frequently cited, such as the injunction to love one's enemies. But Q also contained prophetic and apocalyptic pronouncements, such as the warning always to be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. So Q as a collection of sayings did not help. And since both Weiss and Schweitzer had not argued their case by reference to Q, but from their studies of the narrative Gospels, Jesus was imagined marching to Jerusalem with fire in his eyes, and that was the figure around which the storm gathered. Harnack's Q was soon forgotten, for it seemed to add nothing to the debate. At first, the main source of scholarly discomfort was embarrassment over the image of Jesus as an apocalyptic prophet. Schweitzer's picture of Jesus included a number of very disconcerting features. Jesus was a fanatic about the kingdom of God, mistaken in his announcement of its imminent appearance, wrong to instruct his disciples in their mission, and all but suicidal in his determination to change the course of history by dying willingly for the kingdom's cause. In time, however, the dismay created by Schweitzer's picture of Jesus began to subside, and those who dared to continue the quest found themselves focusing more on the sayings of Jesus than on the dramatic resolve of a hero obsessed with his impossible mission. Slowly it dawned on the scholarly community that the teachings of Jesus still contained a great deal of instruction that was better classed as wisdom than apocalyptic. How could that be? How could an apocalyptic hero also have offered instruction for living in his present messy world? One can trace the scholarly frustration with finding examples of both wisdom sayings and apocalyptic announcements among the teachings of Jesus from the turn of the century to the present. The languages of wisdom and apocalyptic assume different views of the world, and scholars have found it difficult to imagine how Jesus may have merged them in a single message. Historians have therefore invested enormous energy in the investigation of the ancient Near Eastern literatures of proverbial wisdom and apocalyptic vision, seeking to understand each worldview and looking for ways in which each may have been related to the other. Three proposals about proverbial wisdom and apocalyptic sayings in the teachings of Jesus were eventually made during the 1920s and 1930s that commended themselves to the scholarly community. Two of these were made by Rudolf Bultmann and the third by C. H. Dodd. All three assumed that Jesus' message was essentially an apocalyptic preachment, but all three also tried to account for the presence of wisdom discourse among the sayings. None of the three was based on a study of Q. Bultmann tried two solutions to the problem of wisdom and apocalyptic projections in the teachings of Jesus. He was convinced that Jesus had proclaimed the imminent appearance of the kingdom of God by using an apocalyptic idiom. He therefore took pains to identify elements of the prophetic proclamation that could authentically be attributed to Jesus from among the many sayings ascribed to Jesus in the synoptic tradition. He accomplished this in his book on the history of the synoptic tradition, 1921, by granting privilege to apocalyptic sayings and explaining most of the wisdom sayings as later ascriptions added by quote unquote the church. Excuse me. The wisdom sayings were added, he thought, in order to construct an ethic for the meantime when the end of the world did not immediately transpire. This solved the problem by seeing the apocalyptic sayings as authentic and regarding the authentic in quotes and regarding the wisdom sayings as secondary additions to a growing tradition, quote unquote, of the teachings of Jesus. The other solution was set forth in a little book called Jesus, published in 1926. In this book, Bultmann wrote as a New Testament theologian, not as a historian with the task of sorting out the authentic sayings from a burgeoning tradition of largely inauthentic attributions. He argued that since the apocalyptic sayings announced an imminent reign of God without bothering to describe it in detail, and since the wisdom sayings called for an obedience to God without bothering to prescribe what that meant in detail, both could be attributed to the same Jesus and understood as his call for quote unquote radical obedience. Existentialism provided the conceptual framework for this interpretation. For radical obedience meant freedom from the constraints of the past and openness to an uncharted future. Scholars concerned about the authority of the New Testament for Christian faith were generally delighted. Scholars trained as historians of religion hardly knew how to respond. Which Bultmann should one take seriously? These proposals eventually coalesced in the view that the teachings of Jesus were quote unquote, and I hope I say this correctly, eschatological. Eschatology is a modern coinage from the Greek adjective eschatos, which means last, extreme, or final. By this, scholars meant that even though the end of the world did not occur in keeping with apocalyptic expectations, the new age Jesus initiated was so different from the social world at the time and from all that had gone before that the use of apocalyptic idiom was fully appropriate to its announcement. As for Jesus, he could also be described by using the term eschatological. I know I'm not saying that right. He was an eschatological prophet or the last prophet, one who stood at the end of Jewish history and announced its end. This terminology tamed the harsh edge of the apocalyptic, these are all tongue twisters, of the apocalyptic prediction and the teachings of Jesus, and added a sense of urgency even to injunctions in the wisdom mode. But many scholars doubted that the listeners of Jesus' day would have understood the sayings, as Bultmann suggested, and wondered whether they would automatically have made the mental translations necessary for the existential effect. The third solution to the problem of wisdom and apocalyptic, oh, here we go again, um, eschatology in the teaching of Jesus addressed this question. The proposal was made in 1935 by C. H. Dodd in a study of the parables of Jesus. The parables contained sayings in the wisdom mode that Bultmann had slighted and that many scholars considered authentic. How might they be understood in keeping with the eschatological assumption? Dodd's first move was to argue that all the parables were metaphors that referred to the kingdom of God. He then noted that some of them invited the listener to imagine some future advent of the kingdom, but that most were told as if the kingdom could be imagined in the present time. To mediate between the notion of a kingdom reserved for the future and one that was already present, Dodd coined the term realized eschatology to suggest that Jesus intended his listeners to imagine the eschatological, quote unquote, in parentheses, future and final kingdom in the process of being realized in Jesus' own appearance and preaching. A combination of Dodd's parable theory and Bultmann's program of existentialist interpretation finally occurred in America in the late 1960s, and this union resulted in the development of an influential school of parable interpretation in the 1970s. This school is still popular, and many American scholars have been satisfied to think that the parables answer the quest for the historical Jesus and explain the odd mix of wisdom and eschatology in his teachings. Alas, when the time came finally to have another look at Q, the mix of proverbial wisdom with the apocalyptic pronouncements was there. But there were very few parables included among the sayings, and none that could turn the mix into an easily grasped program of realized eschatology. I think I'm starting to say it right. I apologize if I'm not. What to do? Q required explanation. It was the largest collection of the sayings of Jesus at hand. It therefore had to be taken much more seriously than the selection of parables scholars had been using as their database. Q was a collection of sayings made by first century followers of Jesus, not a modern selection of sayings by type that 20th century scholars had put together from different synoptic texts and traditions. A first century collection must have had its own rationale. What if the question of wisdom and apocalyptic in the sayings of Jesus was asked by focusing on Q instead of the parables? What if the imagined historical Jesus, as portrayed in the narrative Gospels, was not allowed to prejudice the study? What if those who made the collection of sayings in Q left some clues to help us understand what they thought about Jesus' wisdom and prophetic speech? A stunning manuscript discovery in 1945 made it possible to get started with such a project. Among the Coptic Gnostic texts found at Nag Hammadi was, of all things, a collection of the sayings of Jesus called the Gospel according to Thomas. See the New English Translation by Marvin Meyer, 1992. The Gospel of Thomas looked very much like Q, and approximately 35% of the sayings in Thomas had parallels in Q. Here, then, was a text closely related to Q that proved the existence of the genre in early Christian circles. It also provided yet another text of the sayings of Jesus for comparative study. Since some sayings appeared in both collections, the two texts were somehow related. Surely a study of Thomas would help with the question of Q. A first breakthrough occurred in 1964 when James Robinson published an article in German on the genre of Q. An English translation was subsequently published in 1971 as Logi Sophon on the Gattung of Q. Sayings of the Sages on the genre of Q. In this article, Robinson drew the connection between Q and Thomas, pointed to the other early Christian collections of sayings, such as the parables in Mark 4, the Didache, and several Coptic Gnostic writings, and then added examples from the wisdom literatures of ancient Egypt and early Judaism. He concluded that the genre of Q was a common form of wisdom literature. He called it sayings of the sages, quote unquote, in keeping with such reference in Proverbs 22:17 and the frequency with which similar formulas appeared in the first lines, incipits of these sayings collections. If Robinson was right, those who collected the sayings of Jesus in Q and the Gospel of Thomas did so on the model of a wisdom genre. Did this mean that the wisdom sayings were more appropriate to these collections than the apocalyptic sayings, and that Jesus' followers had understood them as instructions offered by a sage teacher? The point about Q being the sayings of a sage was not lost on scholars interested in Thomas and Q. Detailed studies began to focus on the presence and importance of the wisdom sayings in these collections. In addition to sayings that crystallized wisdom in the traditional forms of proverb and maxim, scholars also found stylistic traits, aphorisms, stock images, rhetorical units, and mythological metaphors in the idiom of ancient Near Eastern wisdom. Perhaps Robinson's identification of the genre of Q was correct. In the idiom of wisdom, not apocalyptic, was fundamental to the collection. John Kloppenborg thought it was and put Robinson's thesis to the test in a publication called The Formation of Q in 1987. Kloppenborg marshaled a large collection of wisdom literature, not only from the ancient Near East, but also from Greek traditions and from the mixture of cultures that occurred during the Hellenistic era. Excuse me. He was able to show that maxims, proverbs, injunctions, and anecdotes were the idiom of popular philosophy and education during the Hellenistic age, and that collections of this kind of material functioned as handbooks of instruction. Q did exhibit features typical of the Hellenistic handbook of instruction, and Kloppenborg argued that Q was composed on such a model. Several blocks of wisdom material in Q clearly took the form of what Kloppenborg called sapiential instruction. But Q also had features that did not quite fit the model. Wouldn't you know? The difference between Q and the genre of instruction and wisdom had largely to do with the presence of the prophetic and apocalyptic sayings. That Q contained apocalyptic and prophetic sayings was a serious qualification of the wisdom genre. To make matters worse, others had been working on the organization of the material in Q as a literary composition and were emphasizing the importance of prophetic themes. In 1969, Dieter Lohrmann published a study called Die Redaktion der Logienquelle. Hope I said that right. Editing the saying's source is what that means. He showed that the theme of judgment functioned as a principle of organization for Q as a whole. This was an advance, for it meant that Q was more than an aggregate collection of disparate sayings, but it did frustrate the thesis that Q was compiled as a collection of wisdom sayings. Studies appeared in the 1970s and 1980s that put Lohrmann's findings to the test, and a remarkable agreement began to emerge. With slight variations and refinements, Lohrmann's thesis found acceptance and/or confirmation in studies by Arland Jacobson in 1978, Dieter Zeller in 1984, Philip Sellew 1986, Leif Vaage 1987b, and Migaku Sato 1988. It now appeared that the sayings of Q were organized around the theme of judgment. Prophetic and apocalyptic sayings were not peripheral. They were integral to Q's compositional design. At this point, Kloppenborg made a proposal that turned out to be the second big breakthrough in modern Q studies. Kloppenborg revised Robinson's thesis by suggesting that Q had taken shape in stages, that it had a history of collection and composition. The earliest layer of material was indeed a collection of instructions on the wisdom model. It was this material that could be called sapiential instruction. The prophetic and apocalyptic sayings could also be seen as a layer of material, a layer Kloppenborg called the announcement of judgment. The announcement of judgment was indeed the principle of organization of Q at the second stage of its compositional history. but it had not erased large and important blocks of material from the earlier stage of collection. According to this ingenious proposal, both Robinson and Lerman were right. Robinson was right about the generic model of the sayings collection, and especially about the content of the sayings that Kloppenborg assigned to the earliest layer of collection. But Lerman was also right about the fundamental importance of the apocalyptic and prophetic sayings of Q's eventual design. To support his thesis, Kloppenborg produced a detailed study of the text, unit by unit. He summarized the entire history of Q scholarship in an introduction and cited the judgments of others about text critical details throughout. He drew upon a wide range of literary, critical, and thematic observations to support his thesis that the wisdom material was formed apart from interest in or knowledge of the theme of judgment, but that the use of the prophetic and apocalyptic materials presupposed and incorporated the wisdom sayings in Q's present design. Thus, the sequence was established. First, there was a collection of sayings organized as a sapiential instruction. Later, these were incorporated into a composition that developed the theme of judgment by using prophetic and apocalyptic discourse. There was no literary evidence that suggested a reverse sequence. In Kloppenborg's study, Q had finally been treated with respect, regarded as a text with its own integrity, and given the careful reading it deserved. Kloppenborg's study shed new light on the problem of wisdom and apocalyptic sayings in the teachings of Jesus. Both idioms were present in Q, but each functioned differently and entered the history of composition at a different time. According to Kloppenborg, moreover, the wisdom sayings were typical of the earliest layer of Q. If the shift from wisdom to apocalyptic could be explained, it would have to it would have tremendous consequences for the quest of the historical Jesus and a revision of Christian origins. As for Jesus, it would mean that he had probably been more the sage, less the prophet. And as for Christian origins, it would mean that something other than an apocalyptic message and motivation may have impelled the new movement and defined its functional attraction. Kloppenborg did not press the point about the historical Jesus, and he did not argue that just because apocalyptic sayings were added to Q at a second stage of composition, they were not taken from oral tradition as early as that from which the wisdom sayings derived. But others had already grown suspicious of the apocalyptic hypothesis and were prepared to see the stratigraphy of Q as additional evidence for a non apocalyptic Jesus. The evidence had been mounting in studies of the Gospel of Thomas, the parables, the aphoristic quality of the sayings traditions in general, the pre-Markan pronouncement stories, and the non-apocalyptic background of the concept of the kingdom of God. By now it was well known, for instance, that the Gospel of Thomas was thoroughly non-apocalyptic in tenor and that it contains sayings from the very earliest period of the Jesus movements. So Kloppenborg's solution to the presence of wisdom and apocalyptic sayings in Q fit perfectly the growing consensus that Jesus was first remembered for his wisdom. As for Christian origins, it suddenly became clear that the conventional scenario was deeply indebted to the apocalyptic hypothesis. If Jesus had not been an eschatological prophet. The presence of apocalyptic language in the early traditions of the Jesus movements would have to be explained some other way. The conventional view of Christian origins assumed an apocalyptic imagination. Well, that word's used a lot, isn't it? Apocalyptic. At the beginning and gradual shift to the language of wisdom when the world did not end as expected. Now, the sequence worked the other way around. The shift was not from apocalyptic announcement to instruction and wisdom, but from wisdom to apocalyptic. This switch forced a total reconstruction of Christian origins and of the way in which apocalyptic language had been understood to function. The assumption had been that preaching an apocalyptic message of judgment could attract people to a movement that promised salvation from that judgment. It now appeared that an apocalyptic imagination worked only in support of social values and commitments that were generated by other attractions and persuasions already at work within the group. If the entertainment of an apocalyptic imagination was a secondary development in early Jesus circles, what may have been the earlier message and attraction of the Jesus movement? If apocalyptic thinking usually emerges in support of social and cultural loyalties already in place, what might those earlier loyalties at this stage of sapiential instruction have been? And what must have happened to occasion this shift from a wisdom discourse to an apocalyptic imagination? Such question burgeoned in the wake of Kloppenborg's study of Q. That they were questions of consequence for Christian origins was clear. What was not so clear was whether Q could supply the answer. Q would have to be read apart from the patina created by its long contact with the narrative gospels. The people of Q would have come into view, and the social and cultural setting in Galilee would have to be better understood. Only then would it be possible to catch the point of Q's instructions and understand the reason for the shift in Q's discourse from wisdom sayings to apocalyptic pronouncements. What if Q were situated in its Galilean context and read from a Galilean perspective? What if the sequence from instruction in wisdom to the announcement of judgment in Q's compositional history was a clue to stages in the social history of the Jesus movement? It was worth a try, and lo and behold, when the risk was taken, the gospel patina slowly dissolved and a strange new world came into view. So ends part 1.2, an uncommon wisdom from the book The Lost Gospel, the Book of Q and Christian Origins by Burton L. Mack. Stay tuned for part 1.3, Removing the Patina. Thank you for listening.